we're going to start out with a math formula. Oh, man. One of the things we're trying to do in here is we're going to create what eventually we're going to call a work breakdown structure. And the work breakdown structure is how we take our overall project and we put it into what some people might call work packages. In other words, small enough units that we can actually start assigning resources. So who does what? How long do we think it's going to take? So I look outside and they're putting brick on. That was probably a work breakdown. Somebody said, all right, we've got X number of bricks. We know that an average bricklayer can put down 100 bricks an hour. And so we come out with a work breakdown. But to do that, we need a couple of things. And the first thing we're going to do is something called beta analysis. Ugh. Does that sound really scary? And it follows something called a beta distribution. And we've got all these horrible, scary words we learned in stats class. And I'm going to show you the easy way again. So I'm going to be the guy that will hopefully make your life better in other classes. I'm going to show you the shortcuts. So beta analysis, we're going to look at 3 different variables. And so when I write a paper, does anybody in here had to write a paper? And you kind of have some ideas. So we're going to imagine we have to write a 10-page paper. And so I'm just going to edit this right here in Blackboard or inside of my tool. So we're going to write a 10-page paper. Since I can't get my Deseri to work so I can draw on the screen, really handy, we're going to do it this way. So 10-page paper. Well, in your own head, you've already started planning out how long a 10-page paper is going to take, right? And we usually come up with a couple of estimates in our own head, don't we? We kind of come up with a, well, if everything goes right, this paper is going to take 4 hours. Does that seem like a fair number? But maybe my research isn't going to go great, and I'm going to come up with, it's going to take me 10 hours to write a paper. And we do this internally. We already do this. Because we start planning ahead to the next event. Well, if everything goes right, I should be done by 6, and I can go to the bar and have a drink. So we've got our 10-page paper. So we have our best case, or we also call it optimistic version, and we're going to say 4 hours. And then at the other extreme, we have our worst case. So 10-page paper, 10 hours, because we're going to put a lot of effort into it. Things aren't going to go right. Maybe my counter's touched our computer and our word processor breaks in the middle of it. So we're going to say 10 hours. All right, so now we've got the best case and we've got the worst case. But there's a third piece I had up there, most likely. And so when we look at something, a lot of times we make those assumptions in our head. Best case, worst case, and then, the reality is, most likely, it's going to happen in 6 hours. We're going to put down 6 hours in here. Bless you. Plus 6 hours, so that's our most likely. Now, we're going to do something a little strange here. Because usually when I say, oh, that's the best case, I'm pretty optimistic, aren't I? And we know that that's probably a less chance of that happening than our most realistic answer. And we also know that this is an extreme piece, that worst case. And so we're really doing nothing more than a weighted average. And so we're going to take all of these values, and we're going to say, okay, these are all good, but I'm going to take this one in the middle, our most likely, and I'm going to take it times 4. Okay. And when I do that, now I've got an idea of another formula. So I take 1 times this. So 1 times 4 is 4. I can even do that. 4 times 6 is what? 24 plus 10. So if I add all those up, what do I end up with? Well, we can always bring out Excel. And in fact, Excel is kind of a handy tool for these. So 38. Okay, so I end up with 38 for a total on the top. Well, I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to do something. So if I were going to average those, what am I going to divide it by? By 6. And so if I have Excel, I can do this really, really easily. So Excel is our friend with, well, slowly as it loads. So Excel, we can say, well, we have 4, and we know we have 6, and we have 10, and we know this is a value of 1. That's times 4. That's times 1. So we're optimistic. We could call this our pessimistic. And this is our most likely. And so we multiply those times 1 times 4 times 1. And then we add them all up. When we add them all up, so we get our 38, we divide it by 6. So we know that's equal to 38, and we could put that in Excel, but we divide 38 by 6. Sure. We come up with a number. So our beta says, our beta distribution for that, we come up with a value that is probably more realistic. So it incorporates our best case and our worst case and what we think is most likely into this time frame. So now we have a number that we can use. Now, because we've never written a 10-page paper, are we just guessing wildly? Now, how many of you had to write a 10-page paper? All right. So do you have a body of knowledge then that we can look back on and say, oh, the last 10-page paper really took 25 hours. Lauren, you have a look like, oh, my papers don't take that long to write. Some people write papers a lot quicker than others. So we look at that body of knowledge. Some companies perform tasks far quicker than others. So this is a tool we use to get a time for a task. So we can look over our history perhaps and say, what's our worst time? What's our best time? What do we think is most likely? And then we can plug it into this formula. So we're getting closer to that idea of having some way to calculate these task times a little better. So this is a really commonly used formula. Now, the reality is, are these really just guesses? Do we know exactly that it's going to take 6.33 hours? But what we want to do is try to get closer and closer to what the accurate time will be. So we're doing that prediction. And as we go through this class, we're going to start learning some other tools so that we can predict what might happen. Because that's part of this, is when I go out to bid a contract, or I want to evaluate the cost of a contract, or to budget a contract, I really need to know these times. Because if I'm paying an employee $25 an hour, is there a vast difference between 4 hours and 10 hours? Yeah. So it looks like maybe we want to hire somebody who has a better ability to perform that task, and it can certainly save us money. So, beta distribution is really nothing more than optimistic plus 4 times our most likely plus pessimistic divided by 6. It's really nothing more than a weighted average. We're weighting towards that most likely number, but we're taking into account those extremes. Now, is this the only way, once we get that body of knowledge, that history, that we can predict what a task time is going to be? No. And we're going to look at some other models, but this is a very easy model, because everybody in here can divide by 6. I'm a little worried about your counting skills when we had a 39 the other night. But after seeing a video the other day with the Microsoft employee who can't figure out how many days are in a weekend, it's all okay. So this is nothing more than 1 optimistic, 1 pessimistic, 4 times most likely, all divided by 6. And so if I ask you to do a beta distribution, you can write that down very easily. We can put it in Excel, you can do it on a calculator, you can draw it by hand. I just can't draw on the chalkboard and have everybody see that. So we need 3 things for beta. Best, worst, most likely, optimistic, pessimistic, whatever you want to call them. And we can actually construct a beta estimate. So why are we talking about beta estimates? What are we looking at? Well, one of the things we're trying to do is something called a project charter. So we want to create a plan that includes everything from why are we doing this, in other words, that business case, the strategic reasons, because what we are first going to market this plan to often is our own company or outside entities, because we're not guaranteed that this project is going to be a doable project. We're not guaranteed funding. So we have to come up with this project plan. So we have the business case. Why are we doing it? The strategic reasons. Why would we pick the plan to build a curve in the road over building a new business center, for example, on our college? What are the reasons for that? It hopefully is a living document. So in other words, as the project progresses, it becomes a moving document. So it's got the project's history. So if suddenly in the middle of the project our budget gets cut or increased or something changes, that scope changes, that's included in our items that we're going to have in it. So these are a lot of the things that you might see in there. So our objectives, overview, scheduling. So schedules, resource requirements, in other words, what do we need in personnel, people, stakeholders. We talk a lot in here about risk management, so we're going to give you some models for risk. And then evaluation models. So in other words, how do we evaluate that? So what's on that business purpose, the business case? So sometimes some of your classes, they call them use cases or business cases. So what is the scope of this? So this could vary depending on if it's a software project. Maybe we're building a road. Maybe we have an argument that we're going to offer a new MBA program through. What is that strategic reason for this project? So what is the strategic reason we think for building this curve out here? Could traffic get through before? So it really, is it making traffic perhaps easier to travel in the winter with cutting down the curve? Yes, but I don't think that's really the strategic reason. What is the strategic reason for the curve? And making our campus look beautiful. So you're creating an aesthetic environment that you're trying to attract and retain students. Now, there's probably some safety issues, because I've seen a lot of students nearly get killed, usually by me because I'm driving by Casey's, and they're wearing on the sidewalk, they're walking in the street, So hopefully there's some other issues, but the strategic reason, quite frankly, is to enhance the image of Peru when you drive in. Because I guarantee, if you have never been to Peru before, the first time you drive in, you're probably a little less than overwhelmed when you turn in Casey, aren't you? You're like, really? There's a college in this town? Where's it? Oh, it's sort of there. And you really don't get a good view of the college even from the road, do you? So hopefully that's part of it. So the objectives or that mission statement. So what is the scope? So now we get into more details. So what is the scope? In other words, that project consists of doing the road from this point to this point. What are my deliverables? Well, I will have a 6-inch asphalt road with a brick pavers, blah, 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 blah. So that gets into more detail. And then we have a lot of times an overview or an executive summary. Because quite frankly, a lot of times those executives, they're going to get, so if at GE, that vice president may get 10 projects a day. Do they have time to read all of them? No. And so this is kind of a short overview executive summary, and that's what they're going to read very quickly to start with. And quite frankly, a huge number of your people that you've created this document for, this is all they're ever going to read, and it's kind of depressing when you think about it. But you take the details that you got in the rest of your document, and you create that overview. So scheduling. So now we're getting down a little closer to where we need to be. So we know that we have a schedule, so we have a summary. So in other words, our big schedule with those milestones we've figured out. And then we start breaking it down into a work breakdown structure. So we're going to jump back to the work breakdown structure in just a second, but we also need resources. And so once we start breaking that project down, we also know now that we can get some additional resources. So we need to know what this project is going to cost. So by breaking it down into tasks, we can better estimate what a task is going to take. So if I think of a resource as time, at the beginning of a class, do you have any idea how much time you're really going to have to devote to it? But as you start breaking it down into projects and pieces and assignments and papers you have to write, now you've broken it down into those smaller tasks, and you have a better idea how to estimate. And so your initial estimate may have been, well, you know, I've got this online class, and I'm going to spend 1 hour a week on Sunday doing that class. As you get into the class, you may figure out that that's not an accurate estimate. So the smaller units we break those down into, the better we have an ability to get an accurate number. So other things in there, you may have that idea of overhead, in other words, things we don't account for normally. So it's harder to account for. How much time does the accounting department spend on this curve project? So we usually have the stakeholders and personnel pieces. So who are the stakeholders? Who's the sponsor? Project managers usually identified by this point. Some of the key team members. What things do we need in terms of skills, licensing? What do we need to do to train people? And what about any kind of special legal issues? So if we're doing a project at a college to create a new course or a new program, there may be some interesting legal arrangements. And so maybe we have to hire an outside consulting firm or a lobbying firm to go to the coordinating commission to say we need an MBA. Well, we want them to sign a non-disclosure agreement so that they don't go running to some other college and go, hey, I was just working with Peru and they're working on an MBA program. Do we sometimes need some of that information prior? Yes. And so that's one of the reasons. Or maybe we have an industrial process we want to hold near and dear. And then we have risk management. We're going to go into a lot of detail on risk management. So risk, we list potential disasters. So we think about all those things that can happen on a project. So in the case of this curve project, they're behind, and one of the reasons they're behind, what happened this early summer? Did we get a lot more rain than we anticipated? Yeah. And so what about if the load of bricks didn't show up, or the load of concrete, or whatever? So we also look at what are called contingency plans, some way to minimize the effect of issues and disasters. It can't always fix it, but some way to minimize that. So maybe we know, hey, these bricks may not show up on time, but we have an alternative vendor who can ship us bricks, but they're twice as much. So we certainly don't want to do that unless we have to. So, and then we have evaluation. So during this project, we need some way to monitor and see what's going on. So we need to collect data on it. So at the best case, we're collecting data for our future projects. We can also see how our project is on schedule. And somebody mentioned they got to see part of the project planning for this curve project. It's not done yet, so. All right. I'll show you where the product code is in just a second, but you can actually hand the disk over. All right. So we have to have some way to manage this product, and this is part of our scheme. Okay, you need to go to the S drive. And then go ahead and click on it. Prep for 2015. If not, you can log into the computer real quick. All right. We need the activation code. Okay, the activation code is actually on the S drive, but I have to figure out where it's at. Hold on a second. Let me pause my recording and we'll find that so everybody can find that activation code. So, some method we can look at. So we want to have a formal set of evaluations. And so this, one of the advantages to doing this up front is as a project manager, as a person on this project, you know how this project is being evaluated and monitored and controlled. So suddenly you don't get the, hey, you guys are 3 months behind on what schedule, on what, that information is available up front. We know it, we know how things are going. And in fact, everybody then hopefully is using these standards. And so we can see it. If there is an issue, we start working behind or we get ahead, we can see where we're at. So, we've started our planning. And one of the first things we're going to do, we're going to have something called a launch meeting. And so usually we have they may call it a kickoff. And so a lot of times we invite even the public out to this project. We say, great, we've got a giant project we're building. And if you remember the curve project, they actually did that. They had kind of a ribbon cutting, they've got a launch. So everybody now is informed, the public, the stakeholders, everybody on the team, and hopefully everybody understands the scope. And one of the issues with almost any project is something called scope creep. In other words, the scope of that project starts to creep up a little bit. So think about our curve project. Well, while that construction company's there, why don't we have them pour some more sidewalks in front of the TJ Majors? Well, it's not part of the original scope, but now we're expanding that group. It's creeping up. So what's going to happen to our timeline if we start allowing that scope to creep? In other words, on those triple constraints, we're now violating those because we're adding items that are going to increase costs. And most importantly, in a lot of cases, we're affecting time. So, what we're trying to do up front, and I wish that there were software. I've had a couple people in the assignment already ask, well, you tell us to do a work breakdown structure, but not use Microsoft Project. Well, some of this we have to really think about before we even start putting it in Project. Project's a great tool, and we're going to work with Project. It's wonderful, but we have to have that idea of how to break down something into all these tasks. So, I think this is truly correct, that inadequate upfront planning is one of the biggest causes of project failure. And one of the things we do in our own mind, we start breaking down a project. So let's consider our paper as a project, a 10-page paper, and we start to minimize some of the tasks in there. We start, well, I don't really need a step for sharpening my pencil. And I don't really need a task for searching on the internet. Because I know I'm going to just do those pieces. And so we start skipping actually very vital steps. And they may only take a little bit. So on our paper, sharpening your pencil may take 30 seconds. But if we have 100 of those little small pieces we skip, our project gets impacted pretty quickly. So everything we do, every task, needs to be listed. The other thing we need to think about is, what about materials and human resources? So not only do we need to figure out what tasks we need to do, we need to start thinking about what materials are needed for them and what human resources are needed for them. So a work breakdown structure is actually a pretty complicated structure. And so this is an example of a work breakdown structure. So in this particular case, we've done a couple of things. And there's some numbering schemes, and you can find them in the PMBOK in some of your reading. And these are very important, and they allow us to do something interesting. So notice these numberings have a dot notation. So in other words, group 4, group 5, group 6, group 7, group 14 over here. So in other words, this has a lot of different things. So we're breaking them down into smaller and smaller pieces. We start out with the idea, this is called the annual company dinner or whatever we're calling it. And so we're breaking it down. And so we're breaking it down into smaller and smaller pieces. So we come over here, we say event hosts. And so that's in our 4th category. We break that further down, and notice now we say 4.1, 4.2. So each one of these has a unique number. And in fact, we reference it by that number. Microsoft Project, if you look at the left, has unique numbers. So this is a way we can keep track of each piece of work is broken down and has a unique number. And so sometimes we need to go 2 layers down, sometimes we need to go 3. So here, our event host, well, we've got an honoree and we've got an MC. So 4.1, 4.2. Our invitations, we have a mailing list, we may have a design. Maybe we actually end up with having to put in, somebody put stamps on an envelope, those kinds of details. So food and drink, we have to create a menu, the wine list. Well, if it's the Catalina wine mixer, that's pretty important. I got to slip a Step Brothers reference in there at some point. So notice we have, so we start breaking down our tasks into smaller and smaller pieces. And you guys do this. This is stuff you've already done in your own brain. When you're sitting there brainstorming, how do I write this paper? You've started breaking things down into tasks. What you probably didn't do is do it formally. And so formally, we're making that giant tree. And so we can go down 1, 2, 3, in some cases 4 maybe levels. Each task then has its own code. And so we start breaking them into major pieces, and then we start breaking the major pieces into more and more minor pieces, until we reach a state that each is essentially kind of a work product. So it's something that we can wrap our head around in terms of time and schedule and resources. And so we want them in small enough pieces that we can then calculate those costs, because we filter all these down into these work costs. Then we can turn around and push that back upwards and figure out our costing. Because we know now we're down to the part of, we had to hire somebody for 2 hours to lick stamps and put them on envelopes. We know what it's going to cost for stamps. We know what it's going to cost to hire for somebody for 2 hours. No, we need those resources. We know how many envelopes we need. And so we're breaking it down. So, a couple of things. Microsoft Project is great. Conceptually, though, you have to break it down into this tree structure in our own minds, I think, or at least I do, to make it work. And if I just start plugging things into Microsoft Project, like our guy did in the example, I tend to miss things. So I tend to do very rough, bigger pieces, and I don't have that smaller level 2 or level 3 details in there. So this is kind of an interesting way to say it. So it should be delegated to the lowest competent level. In other words, we think about our supervisors out there working on this project. We want to break it down to where that supervisor with the individual workers can say, hey, I know I have to lay 10,000 feet of brick. I need this number of resources, 5 employees, 5 days. That's my work down, my breakdown for that particular thing. And so it takes a little bit of breaking down. It takes a little bit of effort. It's new to us. We haven't done it before in this way.
So how does a work breakdown schedule fit into like an agile environment?
Well, it depends on an agile environment.
Constantly changing like 2 to 4 week iterations where
Your work breakdown, you will really start changing it. So your work breakdown will be in segments or pieces then. So you'll have your upper level work breakdown in an agile environment because we know we have function A, B, and C. So if we're in software development, for example, we know that software can certainly change. So A, B, we may get A working through it. We'll actually feed that knowledge of what those task times were back into smaller. So we tend to have smaller pieces in it. Now, will I go through and do an estimate for the entire project originally? Yes. But we know that it's going to be subject to change, especially in an agile concrete, a construction environment is certainly subject to change. And so one of those things, when we change those work breakdown structures, we have a constantly evolving piece of document that says, well, this bricklaying, we thought it was going to be 10 hours. It really took us 12, and we can actually then change our budget and change items in the future to make up for it, because we may have budgeted for 10,000 man hours total. And so we have to change the rest of the project around it. And so here, for example, is a breakdown on a staff orientation. I know it's kind of small and hard to read, and I got to squint, but what we're looking for is, here's another way to do it. We break these down into kind of bigger chunks. So these are big durations. We start then getting this idea of precedence in there. So precedence, we know that things have to happen before another task can occur. And so in Microsoft Project, we got to see very quickly how some of those work. And Hunter, this is kind of the basis for that network diagram again. You're already having the flashbacks? So precedence, in other words, it's nothing unusual. It's how do I perform tasks and in what order? And we know there's things we have to do before other ones. So the best example I always use is taking a shower. We've all taken a shower, right? I hope. Then you're looking at me like, what is he talking about? We've all taken a shower. And even in a shower, if we break our work down into specific tasks, do we know that there's things we have to do before we can take a shower? Can I just come home, dressed in my shirt and pants, and jump in the shower? Well, I can. It doesn't work that well. So a precedent to taking a shower is we got to get naked. But maybe there's even something before that. Close the curtains. So we think about precedents in order of what do we have to do before we can do something else. So if I'm going to build a road, there's a certain order that things have to be done. I can't pour the asphalt until the dirt work's done. I can't lay the brick until the sand and the concrete is in place. I can't put up the electric lights until you pour the little concrete bases. I can't shampoo my head until I take it out of the ponytail. Well, in some cases. So precedence is really just that idea of what do we have to do first? Can I have multiple things that have to occur first? I can. I certainly can. And so in this particular case, not only do we have predecessors, and in fact some of these have multiple predecessors, but I am already thinking about what resources I'm going to assign, because we know that those resources are both financial and in a lot of cases, human resources. Who am I gonna assign? What am I gonna assign? And so I've started breaking this down a little more. What resources do I need? And who are they assigned to? How are we gonna do that? And so those work breakdown structures can get fairly convoluted. And it's one thing that I wish Microsoft Project did a little bit better. I wish Microsoft Project had a little bit better way to break tasks down. It kind of assumes we've done this on paper, and quite frankly, and I know it's a strange world because I live in technology, it's almost one of those you just sit down with a sheet of paper because your mind seems to work a little better when you start writing these down and expanding those tree diagrams about all those different tasks.